Evelyn and Mark had been together for 10 years when they decided to take a leap of faith. Both in their late 30s and eager for a change of pace, they pooled their savings to buy a fixer-upper in the countryside. The property was a sprawling estate, complete with an overgrown orchard, a rickety barn, and, at its heart, an abandoned farmhouse that seemed frozen in time. It was exactly what they wanted. A project they could pour their energy into, a fresh start far from the noise of the city. The farmhouse was a sturdy 2-story structure, though years of neglect had left it in poor condition. Its roof sagged, the windows were cracked, and ivy climbed its stone walls like veins. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. Furniture covered in tattered sheets stood as silent witnesses to the passage of time, while faded wallpaper peeled from the walls. Evelyn was particularly enchanted by the orchard. Apple trees stretched in neat rows as far as the eye could see, their branches gnarled and heavy with the weight of decades. Though most of the trees were barren, a few still bore fruit, their small, misshapen apples clinging stubbornly to the branches. Their first few weeks were filled with hard work. They cleared debris, cleaned every corner, and started making lists of repairs. Mark focused on structural issues, while Evelyn poured herself into the orchard, determined to revive it. The house itself was full of quirks that fascinated and frustrated them. Narrow doorways led to hidden rooms, and strange alcoves seemed to serve no purpose. One day, while clearing out the attic, Mark found a stack of old letters tied together with twine. The letters were dated from the 1940s and were written by a woman named Clara to her husband, James. They detailed her struggles to maintain the farm while he was away at war, her loneliness, and her dreams for their future. Evelyn was captivated, reading each one aloud to Mark in the evenings as they sat by the fireplace. Then they found the journal. It was buried in a drawer in the kitchen, tucked beneath yellowed papers and an old set of keys. The leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages were filled with Clara's delicate handwriting. At first, the entries mirrored the letters, accounts of her daily life, her longing for James, and her pride in the orchard. But as the journal progressed, the tone shifted. Clara began to write about her neighbors, particularly a man named Mr. Talbot who owned the farm next door. Her entries became increasingly paranoid. She described how Mr. Talbot would linger near the property line, staring at the house for hours. She wrote of hearing footsteps outside her window at night and finding trampled grass near the orchard. In the final entries, Clara's handwriting became erratic. She claimed that someone, perhaps Mr. Talbot, had been entering the house while she slept. She described waking up to find things moved or missing. The last page was scrawled with a single sentence. "I know what you've done." Evelyn felt a chill as she read the final words. Mark dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely woman, but Evelyn couldn't shake the unease that settled over her. A few days later, while pruning the trees at the far edge of the orchard, Evelyn noticed something odd. The ground near one of the trees seemed disturbed, as though it had been dug up and hastily refilled. She called Mark over, and together they dug into the loose soil. What they uncovered was a rusted metal box. Inside were photographs, all black and white, depicting a man and a woman standing near the orchard. Evelyn recognized the woman as Clara. The man was unfamiliar, but the way he stood close to her, his hand on her back, suggested an intimacy that didn't match the letters she had written to James. Beneath the photos was a small, folded note. When Evelyn opened it, she found another fragment of Clara's handwriting. "They'll never find out." The discovery left Evelyn shaken. She couldn't stop thinking about Clara's paranoia and her cryptic journal entries. Who was the man in the photographs? What had Clara meant by, "They'll never find out"? That night, Evelyn dreamed of the orchard. In her dream, the trees were full of ripe apples, their glossy red skins glistening in the sunlight. But as she approached one of the trees, she realized the apples weren't fruit at all. They were faces, contorted and screaming. She woke up drenched in sweat. The following morning, she told Mark she wanted to take a break from the house. The repairs were taking a toll on her, and she needed some space to clear her mind. Mark encouraged her to visit her sister for a few days, assuring her that he'd continue working on the property in her absence. Evelyn left, but she couldn't relax. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the orchard and the cryptic words Clara had left behind. When she returned 3 days later, the house was eerily quiet. Mark's car was parked in the driveway, but he didn't answer when she called his name. She searched the house and found his tools abandoned in the living room. Finally, she ventured into the orchard. It was there, beneath the same tree where they had found the box, that she found him. Mark was lying on the ground, unconscious but breathing. His hands were caked with dirt, and beside him was a freshly dug hole. When he woke, Mark couldn't explain what had happened. He remembered feeling compelled to dig, as though something in the orchard was calling to him. Evelyn wanted to leave the house immediately, but Mark insisted they stay. Over the next few weeks, their relationship began to deteriorate. Mark became obsessed with the orchard, spending hours wandering among the trees. Evelyn grew increasingly withdrawn, plagued by nightmares and a sense of dread she couldn't explain. They finally decided to sell the property, but no buyers were interested. The house, with its strange history and crumbling facade, remained theirs. Years later, Evelyn would look back on their time at the farm and wonder what had really happened there. She never went back to the orchard, and the answers to Clara's cryptic words remained buried in the past, along with whatever secrets the trees held. The Carter family wasn't looking for luxury when they bought the old farmhouse at the edge of Norwood. They wanted space, a place where their 2 boys could run wild and away from the city's chaos. The house, a long-abandoned property with sagging eaves and a patchy yard, was cheap. Too cheap. "You sure it's livable?" Amanda Carter asked the realtor skeptically as they stood on the uneven porch. "It's sturdy," the realtor replied. "Just needs some TLC." The price was unbeatable. By the end of the month, they had packed their belongings and moved in. The house smelled of stale air and damp wood. Layers of grime coated every surface, and the wallpaper in the hallways curled like peeling skin. It was a fixer-upper in every sense, but the Carters were optimistic. The first few weeks were uneventful. Amanda spent her days scrubbing floors and painting walls, while her husband, Eric, tackled minor repairs. The boys, Jeremy and Nathan, loved the open fields surrounding the house and spent most of their time outdoors. It wasn't until they decided to clear out the barn that things began to feel off. The barn was massive, with high, cobweb-covered rafters and wooden beams thick enough to support the weight of decades. Inside, they found tools rusted with age, a broken plow, and several crates filled with rotting hay. Beneath one of the crates, Amanda discovered an old trunk. It was locked, but Eric managed to pry it open. Inside were a series of notebooks, their covers warped and pages yellowed with time. The handwriting was messy, often difficult to read, but Amanda was intrigued. The notebooks belonged to someone named Walter Green, who had lived in the house decades earlier. His entries were a strange mix of mundane farm records and increasingly erratic personal reflections. The first few entries were unremarkable. July 2nd, 1961, planted corn. Rain coming. August 10th, 1961, good harvest this year. Sold to town market. But as Amanda read on, the tone shifted. November 18th, 1961, saw footprints in the barn. Not mine. January 3rd, 1962, door was open again. I know I locked it. March 15th, 1962, I hear them at night. Moving around, the entries became more disjointed, sometimes written in all caps or with words scratched out angrily. Walter wrote about hearing noises in the attic and finding his tools misplaced. He mentioned feeling watched and described waking up to find muddy footprints leading from the back door to his bedroom. The final entry was short. They're here. Amanda felt a chill as she closed the notebook. She laughed nervously when Eric teased her for being spooked, but the words lingered in her mind. Over the following days, little things started to go wrong. A glass Amanda was sure she had placed on the counter ended up shattered on the floor. Jeremy's toy car disappeared, only to reappear days later in the hallway upstairs. The attic door, which had been stuck shut when they moved in, was suddenly ajar. One night, as Amanda lay in bed, she heard a faint creak from the floorboards above. Eric was already asleep, and she told herself it was just the house settling. But the creaks turned into slow, deliberate footsteps. The next morning, she mentioned it to Eric, who dismissed it. It's an old house. The wood expands and contracts. Amanda wasn't convinced. She started noticing other strange occurrences. The faint smell of cigarette smoke in the kitchen, even though neither she nor Eric smoked. Scratches on the walls that hadn't been there before. The boys complained of toys going missing or being moved from their rooms. One evening, Amanda decided to investigate the attic. Armed with a flashlight, she climbed the narrow stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was filled with junk. Old furniture, trunks, and piles of newspapers. As she moved the flashlight beam around, something caught her eye. In the corner, under a dusty tarp, was a sleeping bag and a stack of empty cans. Amanda's heart raced. Someone had been living here. She ran downstairs to tell Eric, who was equally alarmed. They called the police, who searched the house thoroughly but found no sign of anyone. They assured the Carters that whoever had been living there was long gone. But Amanda wasn't so sure. Over the next week, the unease grew. Doors they knew had been locked were found open. Jeremy claimed he saw a shadow move across the hallway at night. Nathan woke up crying, saying he had heard someone whispering his name. Eric, ever the skeptic, insisted there was a rational explanation for everything. But Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Her suspicions were confirmed one afternoon when she was folding laundry. She heard a faint rustling sound coming from the vent near the floor. When she knelt down to listen, she heard it again. Breathing. Amanda screamed and called Eric. Together, they pried the vent cover off, revealing a narrow crawl space. It was too small for an adult to enter, but they shone a flashlight inside and found something chilling. An old shoe and a crumpled pack of cigarettes. That night, they decided to stay at a motel. The next morning, they returned with the police, determined to get to the bottom of things. The officers searched every inch of the house, including the crawl spaces and the attic. What they found sent shivers down Amanda's spine. In the basement, behind a false wall, they discovered a hidden room. It was small and claustrophobic, with a single mattress on the floor and piles of empty food wrappers. There were scratch marks on the walls, as though someone had been trapped there. The police concluded that a squatter had been living in the house before the Carters moved in and had likely been sneaking in and out through the hidden room. But they couldn't explain how the scratches on the walls were fresh or how the doors kept unlocking themselves. The Carters sold the house a month later and moved back to the city. Amanda never stopped wondering about the person who had shared their home. Was he watching them the whole time? Did he ever leave? Or was he still there, waiting for the next family to move in? Lillian Carter hadn't been back to Pine Ridge in nearly 2 decades. Not since the accident that had left her family fractured. Her father's death on the icy roads of the small town had marked the end of her childhood there, and her mother had sold the family home shortly after, eager to leave behind the suffocating grief. Now, at 32, Lillian found herself back in the sleepy little town for the first time, not by choice but necessity. She was the sole heir to her estranged aunt, a woman she barely remembered, who had passed away 2 months earlier. Among her meager belongings was a crumbling old house at the edge of town, one that had been abandoned for years. It wasn't just any house. It was the Deacon property, notorious in the town's history for being a place where bad things happened. Fires had gutted half the property 50 years ago. 10 years later, a family renting the house had vanished without explanation. Their car left in the driveway with the keys still in the ignition. Every local had a story about why they avoided it. When Lillian first laid eyes on the house, she couldn't help but feel unease. It sagged like a broken animal, its roof warped and the front porch riddled with gaps. The once beautiful Victorian exterior had faded to a washed-out gray, with ivy snaking its way up the walls. Stepping inside was worse. The air smelled of mildew and decay. Layers of dust coated every surface, and the oppressive quiet inside was only occasionally broken by the creak of floorboards or the faint rustle of animals in the walls. She spent the first few hours exploring cautiously, flashlight in hand, noting the rot and water damage that would likely make selling the house impossible without extensive repairs. The house's layout was strange, full of narrow hallways that twisted unexpectedly, rooms that seemed too small to serve any real purpose, and a basement door in the kitchen that didn't lock properly. She decided to stay overnight, not out of any practical reason, but because she wanted to prove to herself that she wasn't afraid of some crumbling old building. Lillian set up her sleeping bag in what must have been the living room. She made herself a small dinner from a sandwich she had packed and tried to ignore the feeling of being watched by the peeling wallpaper. She scrolled through her phone for a while, the weak signal a reminder of how isolated she was. By midnight, the noises started. First, it was faint, a soft scratching sound that seemed to come from the walls. She told herself it was just rats. Then there was the sound of something heavy being dragged across the upstairs floor. That one made her sit bolt upright, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. She debated whether to investigate or not. Her logical brain told her it was just an old house settling or some animal making its home inside. But her gut told her something was off. When the dragging noise started again, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Climbing the stairs was like ascending into another world. The upstairs was darker, the air heavier. She shone her flashlight into the first room at the top of the stairs, finding nothing but piles of debris. The noise came again, louder now, and seemed to echo from the farthest room down the hallway. She pushed open the door to find a bedroom, empty except for an old wardrobe that stood crookedly in the corner. The dragging sound had stopped abruptly. Lillian approached the wardrobe with hesitant steps, her flashlight beam jittering slightly from her unsteady hands. When she opened it, she found only moth-eaten clothes and empty hangers. Relieved but still on edge, she turned to leave the room. That's when she noticed something on the floor, a small, smudged handprint in the thick layer of dust. It didn't belong to her. Lillian's heart raced as she backed out of the room and hurried downstairs. She double-checked that the front door was locked and tried to convince herself it was an old mark from before the house had been abandoned. The dragging sound didn't return that night, but sleep was impossible. She spent the rest of the night sitting against the living room wall, her flashlight aimed at the staircase. The next morning, she resolved to leave. Whatever sentimental value her aunt had placed on this house, it wasn't worth her peace of mind. She began packing up her things, but something compelled her to investigate the basement before she left. Maybe it was stubbornness, a desire to prove to herself that she wasn't being irrational. The basement was worse than she imagined. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight, and the air was thick with the smell of mold. Her flashlight revealed broken furniture, scattered tools, and something odd in the corner, an old wooden chest with its lid slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of her. When she lifted the lid, she found nothing inside but a collection of old photographs. She picked one up and froze. It was a picture of her father as a child, standing in front of the Deacon house. She rifled through the photos, her unease growing with each one. They were all of her father or her aunt, taken at various points in their childhood. Some were dated as far back as the 1960s, but the house looked the same as it did now, weathered and abandoned. Her aunt had never mentioned living here, and neither had her father. Why were these photos here, buried in a forgotten chest? Lillian left the house shortly after, determined to sell it to the first buyer who would take it. In the days that followed, she tried to research the Deacon house's history, but found only vague rumors and half-remembered anecdotes from the locals. Her aunt's lawyer had no explanation for how the house had come into her possession. The house remained unsold, sitting empty on the edge of town like a monument to things best left forgotten. Lillian never returned, but sometimes, in her quiet moments, she thought about that small, smudged handprint and the way her father had never spoken of his childhood in Pine Ridge. She never found out who or what had been in the house with her that night.